Hello, everyone, and today we are joined by the esteemed Nadim Bakhshov, and we are going to be discussing his is it your most recent work? I'm trying to think. You may have had something I never know from Zero Books against capitalist education, which just to start things off right with we sort of started here last time too, but then we got pulled aside. I'll try to be a little bit more focused on the work today. But one thing that characterizes against capitalist education is that rather than just being sort of your standard prose work or an essay, it's composed in a dialogue format, sort of as an homage to the ancient Platonic dialogues. Though homage might not be the best word because it's not just meant to be a tip of the hat. There's a suggestion that we should perhaps return and explore this sort of different way of writing about ideas, or at least ask the question why the dialogue form doesn't sort of experience much reiteration after Plato. I mean, there are exceptions. There are people who will occasionally write dialogues, but by and large, it's an unexplored format. Why don't you could you tell us about those choices that you made in writing it as a dialogue and what you think is significant about the dialogue?
Absolutely. It's interesting, as you say, that dialogue hasn't really been taken up, and it's something that makes an encounter with philosophy now quite an unusual experience. And I mean, the real question is, why is that? Why has that not really been taken up? And what advantage possibly is there writing something in that particular format? I suppose my personal answer is that I feel now that we are in a situation where academia has become so heavily stratified and specialized that you can meet and encounter academics who are studying, not say a Derrida, but they'll study a footnote in Derrida referenced by another paper written by someone else, and so on and so forth. There is an endless conversation, but there is a sense that they're spinning out things without it really stopping to actually confront the basic premises of what they do. What I find about conversation, because interestingly enough, I write all my own notes in a conversational style, is that in a conversation, you can interrupt someone. And that structure of interrupting, suddenly diverting off into a different direction, you have complete and utter freedom to do that. And that works if you're trying to explore a terrain where you don't have any real foothold or preconceived structure. If you're doing philosophy and you're trying to map out a new territory, you really need to have as much freedom as possible. And I think the conversation style, certainly as a mode of thinking and also as a mode of writing, allow that to happen. So having two protagonists rather than just a monologue, essentially, which is what most philosophical books are, where they're spinning out. They might end up being quite discursive in their style, but they tend to spin out a thread or a handful of threads and explore and let them unfold. But in a conversation, the fact that as you're unfolding a thread, you can just suddenly interrupt it. And why would you want to do that? It seems disruptive. One of the comments from the publisher really early on was it might jar the ordinary reader. But the opposite experience is the one that most people who've read the book have come across, that actually it feels very naturalistic to encounter two people talking to each other. And when they do interrupt each other, it seems, because there's obviously a little bit of crafting involved here, it seems a natural, almost a way of pausing it and allowing the conversation to open up and unfold in different directions. So I think conversation allows a type of philosophy to occur which goes below the orthodoxy and allows you to suck in and draw anything you like.
As you were speaking, it occurred to me that but another perhaps positive aspect is if you're committing yourself to write dialogically, that compels you to have a sense of the alternative positionalities, as opposed to with the discursive framework where you can just sort of, monologically as opposed to dialogically explicate your position. Of course, that requires a certain sense of discipline on the part of the writer, not to sort of use the dialogue format fallaciously to, set up a straw man. You could do that too, but that's sort of departing from fidelity to a certain philosophical integrity. The other thing that occurred to me while you were speaking, this is a sort of question I was going to maybe ask on the latter end of the conversation, but just to go ahead and bring it out here, is the relationship with meaning. That's something that in the latter portion of your book you pick up as of some significance. You highlight meaning as sort of what's really energizing the real or reality. Perhaps conversation is a lattice or a mantle or a conduit through which meaning might be able to find more effective expression than discursive orientation. And what do you think is the relationship between the operations of meaning and conversation?
Oh, quite a lot. Okay, so I like your use of the word, use something akin to scaffolding. And you used an idea that within the space of a conversation, it clearly allows something to emerge. And the idea that you have several participants, if you like. If you imagine a ring of some kind with different people situated around this ring, obviously that this is just a idealization. And the interaction, the field of the conversation, if it flows in a particular dynamic, it can be extremely powerful. But there is a kind of, you say meaning, there is also a kind of thinking that occurs within that setting that has a different type of quality and force to it than someone sitting on their own, meditating and chewing over something or writing something down. So I see conversation very, very close to, at the end of Portrait of an Artist by James Joyce, he comes out with a really peculiar phrase. I'm going to get it wrong, but it was something like forging new stuff out of the smithy of my conscience. The idea that there is some furnace burning away, and out of it, you're pulling out new possibilities and new realities. And I feel that if you set up a conversation in a way that allows a certain flow and a fluidity, and there is a genuine interest, a mutual, I don't know, I don't want to idealize it because you are always participants in it. There is a chance for something new to emerge. But the question of meaning comes to my fundamental position that meaning is constituted as a response to situation and context, if you like, this threefold relationship we were talking about, that if I were to say to you, what is for hermeneutics, and even to some extent, how do signs operate, you find this threefold structure. So if you then take that idea and put it on top of a conversation and ask, how does it decode how a conversation works? Well, a conversation is clearly at an intersection point of lots of different contexts. And so what makes it really, really interesting is that the actual flow of discussion from different points of view, the fact that it's constantly being refracted through all these different contexts, even as two people talk and bounce ideas off each other, there is a real possibility that that boundary, that complex shifting boundary in the conversation, is the ground out of which new meanings are formed, and that we can't have meaning unless we have something flowing across a boundary. It's a peculiar almost political sounding statement.
Now, let me step in and ask you to recapitulate this sort of trifold structure with context and so forth. We had discussed this in the first conversation, but I think it would be perhaps salutary for you to recapitulate that again.
Okay. So one of the fundamental axioms of my work has been to challenge the atom as the concept of what a unit of reality is. Is a unit of reality basically, can you turn it into a one-to-one relationship with either a word, so you get logical atomism and the early Wittgenstein and Russell and people like this, is reality, or you get also in science the notion of an atom, a particle, an entity, which can be isolated, its properties read off, and then combined to create reality, the reality that we encounter in our phenomenal field. That's been one of the dominant paradigms of both scientific and in some ways social thinking for a very long time. And it brings with it also the notion of a substance being, if you think back to John Locke, a substratum underlying the phenomenal world out of which the phenomenal world will somehow build itself and constitute. But the problem with these types of ideas are that they remain entirely insensitive to the lived experience of everyday life. And the person who brought that to my attention was Heidegger. So, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Heidegger for lots of reasons, but the element of his thought that works for me is the notion that being in the world is a structure that means that you are always situated. That would suggest that, just as Marx thought as well, we are essentially, if we were to have an essence, in some way, this essence is related to our social constitution. But what is the social field? Well, the social field then becomes a context, a frame within which even our most private thoughts are responding to in some way. It doesn't mean you can read someone's thought, but when you get to know someone, you understand how they feel and how they think about the world. Can I stop there?
Say that again.
Shall I stop there or continue?
Oh, no, that's a natural point of segue. I was actually going to go. One other person, Aristotle, I think, also but as you were talking about the notion that who and what we are ultimately is related to a social field, put me in mind of Aristotle's notion of the zoon politikon, or man as a political animal, which unfortunately, that translation, while literally effective, carries with it in English connotations that sort of almost obscure what the polis is in Greek thought, which is indeed a social field. That actually leads to another line of conversation about your use and enthusiasm around Plato, because some people would suggest that Plato is actually at odds with the political hypothesis in the Republic. And maybe we can come back to that if you want. But before we get too far afield, I think we should draw back to your book's title, Against Capitalist Education. Maybe we should spell out what's going on there. What is capitalist education that you're opposing here? What would you say signifies, denotes it specifically?
Simply, I would attempt to express it like this, that capitalism is a mode of social organization, primarily, and economics is a flow of capital through this field of social organization. But this actual form, this social form, or this complex of social forms which constitute capitalism, have a certain value structure built into them. And this value structure is, for me, reductive. It elevates the significance of numbers and the flow of capital above the level of a human being. It completely distorts, for me, if it's extended to every context, how social interaction really works. that it reduces it to the idea, or this idea of exchange, its concept of exchange. Giving, altruistic acts don't quite fit into the capitalist picture. It's much more, I give you something as a trade for something else. And what I see capitalism doing in education, but also as it permeates lots and lots of other elements of our life, is that it turns all of our social relationships into essentially a trade relationship. I will only give you something if I see a benefit to me. So it's no longer a symbiosis between creatures which will mutually benefit through their interaction and co-act in some way. It is more a kind of mutual parasitism. And so I would say is where my issue is with capitalism, and how its ideology or its ontology creates a problem. In education, you cannot have education unless you premise it on the basis of generosity of spirit. You know, if a student comes to you and your basis of it is that I'm going to gain something out of this relationship in return for you, my wage, if you make a calculation like that, you undermine the fact that education frames the whole relationship. And by bringing in this capitalist exchange trade relationship, superimposing it, you actually cancel out what makes education, for me, fundamentally a civilizing and a fundamental force in our life.
Yes, I think that's quite adept. That the relationship between the teacher and the student is fundamentally one of generosity and trust. Generosity and trust within the market context. I mean, this is a point that some people might contest, to be fair, but in my perception, the market context tends to perhaps it doesn't do this intrinsically, but within the cultural dispensation where we are ensconced, it tends to encourage a kind of small-mindedness, and it's almost antithetical to generosity and trust, right? Because you're trying to maximize your profit or what have you. But to sort of push it, I mean, the counterpoint is that someone might raise is that what I'm describing is a market space where people are acting in bad faith. And that, in fact, it can be a beneficial sort of space for human interaction. The presupposition, I don't know. But I mean, I have serious problems with that.
Right.
But we don't have my problem with it being that it seems that if people are acting in good faith toward each other, then they don't need to rely on the construct of price. They can just exchange with each other, whatever they need, or they can interact in a relationship that isn't bounded by this overlay of monetization.
Yeah.
The counterpoint there is that, well, how do you deal with the issue of scale? But I don't think that actually fundamentally changes the contour of the problem. Let me ask you this, though, which is going at another aspect of it. You're talking about the ontology of capitalism as grounded in a particular sort of mathematics, right? There's this, and I think maybe it even is coming out of a dimension of the Enlightenment. With, for example, as Husserl put it, Galileo mathematicized nature. Do you think that there is a connection between that Galilean move to mathematicize nature and what's happening under capitalism? And if so, what do you think that relationship is?
That's a very, very good question. I would characterize the mathematization that Galileo gave or did as a quantification of quality. And I think when you look at the way the sciences generally operate, their basic starting point, and it's particularly prevalent in social sciences, to gain legitimacy, you have to quantify phenomena. But in order to quantify it, you reduce it to some kind of scale and some kind of measure. Now, I'm not completely dismissing this as a worthless activity, but for me, the moment you take a quality that you experience, or a quality in nature, let's say in social relations, and you reduce it to a number value, I think of game theory, for example, and my objections to it. What you end up doing is, in order for the model and the system to work, you have to put at the base of your quantification of nature a bunch of assumptions. And those assumptions essentially cut out certain features of reality. Now, we know this because natural sciences have done this for a very long time and been very successful in spotting patterns and relationships in nature by quantifying. But when you turn to human beings, the subject who themselves has become the object, the elements that you cut out themselves need to be questioned, whether that abstraction, whether that system, that model, or quantifying those features of human behavior, social behavior, individual behavior, are actually justified. I mean, it's a very, very big question. So mathematics, if you can see mathematics as this quantification process, yes, there's great merit because it lets you abstract, pattern spot, and the rest of it. I see the strength in there, but quantifying certain qualitative elements of the real world are very, very reductive.
Yes, and the reason I asked the question was because in the book, part of the reason I asked the question, in your book, you talk about how it's actually, I believe it's George's view, an error to identify mathematics narrowly as concerned merely with number. And you want to, or he wants to posit a different kind of mathematics. I was wondering if you could talk more about that. What is this alternative approach to mathematics that doesn't connect it so tightly with number?
Okay, so there are two threads to this. One is to go back to the original Greek meaning of mathematics, and it's oddly associated with the word learn, to learn. And it's very closely associated in its early history, or the prehistory of Greek, certainly early Greek mathematics, developing a symbol system that helps you repeat something. How can I put it? If you were trying to describe or understand something and you had no symbol for it, the next day you might forget. So crudely put, if I wanted to teach it to you by writing it down using some kind of system of signs and code, you have something which is repeatable and transmissible, and there we then have the beginning of a body of of knowledge of some kind. That's one particular aspect that I have in the back of my mind when I think of mathematics. The second is the development of non-Euclidean geometry in mathematics, and all these various different topographical and topological models of mathematics where the central concept is a structure and not a number. So you have very, very complex geometric forms which you can look at them and abstract number from them, but it strikes me that some of them seem to suggest that structure is a much more fundamental concept to the later development of mathematics than number. Number, I think, I have several problems with number. Number is the basis of the ontology for capitalism, and whether capitalism deliberately latched onto the number and thought, yeah, we can count, we can do all this kind of stuff. Whether it was necessary relation, I can't say, but it seems to have become something that capitalism works very well with. But structure is a very different and a different type of concept, because structure is slightly less quantifiable in a really critical element. So if I were to say to you what someone's personality is, that's John, he has a certain type of personality and so on, and you were to then say, oh, on the scale of emotional intensity is 7 on this scale, and you gave me a number system, I'd say that's perhaps some insight. But if I were to say to you that his personality was, if you like, a structure of some kind, which was complex, had various different flexibilities within it. It wasn't fixed and an entity of some kind, but this structure informed the person who then behaves in various different situations. Suddenly, a new idea of the thing, the object, what's standing behind the phenomena comes into view.
Which, indicates possibilities for dynamism and flexibility, and perhaps aesthetically is more consonant with the sort of value set that you were noting earlier as characteristic of bona fide education, where a spirit of generosity and trust is abiding or prevalent. So, this you want to connect this alternative sense of mathematics in the book to a broader project of developing a new human science, and you want to sharply distinguish this from the natural science. And I have to say, I was a bit hung up because we have to look here at what one means by science, right?
Yeah,
and I know that it's a sort of a contest for discourse. You want to sort of take back the notion of the science from how it's been sort of subjugated to the framework of the natural sciences, physics, biology, and so forth. But I'm wondering if one can really effectively take on that recuperation without, in the process, assimilating the very sort of presuppositions which have made the natural sciences problematic for certain sorts of undertakings, such as education. So, I mean, maybe you should elucidate what you mean by science. Or,
okay.
And in fact, my concerns are sort of also raised in the book, perhaps in a more concise fashion, I believe. But go ahead, and I'll just let you talk now.
Okay.
Blah, 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 blah.
Okay, so here's a classic idea of the natural sciences, which we both know because everyone loved it: causality. And causality in causal thinking is seen as definitive of a certain type of scientific practice, i.e. one event causes another, therefore find those, hypothesize about those, and you've got the basis of a natural science or a relationship between particles. So the classic image that you or I may have come across, I certainly have, is the Newtonian one of billiard balls. So the classic image is, here's a billiard table. I've got all these objects on a billiard table, and no one in a million years would contend that if I hit one at a certain angle and I can measure it precisely, and it collides with another one, that one will deflect at a particular angle. There's the basis of Newtonian science. That's why Newtonian science effectively works, because it describes that and models that perfectly. So I say, that's fine. But then ask yourself this question. When Einstein appeared on the scene, he didn't refute Newtonian mechanics. But what he showed was that Newtonian mechanics as a model was an approximate model that worked within limited domains of application. And Einstein effectively provided a new conceptual scheme, which was broader, and yet you could still, through an approximation, apply Newton for these more limited fields of application. So extend that same idea and look at the conceptual fabric underlying natural science. You have causality, the idea that an event causes another. And you have some respectable analytical thinkers who challenge this idea. Donald Davidson is a very good example, who talks about causal effect of action and behavior and belief and thought on other people. And they're trying to work through an idea of how causality could work. But here's my contention. The hermeneutic, the development of hermeneutics is a challenge which came out of romantic thought in German philosophy, created the platform for an alternative and a broader and a richer framework of how two things are related. So instead of event A causing event B, with human beings, event A, someone shouts at me, doesn't cause me to shout back at them. we know as human beings that there can always be an alternative response, because interpretation, which is the key term that Heidegger latched onto, can interpose itself between the so-called event and effect. So then I thought to myself, does hermeneutics hold a key here for a broader framework which under limited application looks causal? It looks like A caused B, but it only works because we are limiting the context, we're reducing it, and therefore we see that happen in that way. But actually the correct conceptual framework is a hermeneutic framework. Event A doesn't cause event B. Event A occurs, there's a process of translation and interpretation, and event B of some kind occurs. And that suddenly opened up the possibility that a human science built on hermeneutic foundations, on that principle, could, under approximation, deal with the notion of causality in the natural sciences.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're suggesting is that the sort of order onto which science is could be latched isn't necessarily an order of a strictly causal nature. There still abide within it certain, let us say, regularities that you might say are more adeptly characterized as structural rather than numeric. Retaining the category of structure because it's more, it works better with the idea that you need to save the qualitative aspect of what's presenting itself. And additionally, grounding the structure which the science is attempting to articulate with a hermeneutically informed sensibility. That is an aliveness to the reality of the interpretive relation, which reconnects with the question of what is reality's actual ground or grounds. And it's not an atomic unit, right? It's not some singularity. It's rather actually complex at its very basis, as we were noting at the beginning of the conversation. So I'm sort of still detained by the question of knowledge. Science etymologically goes back to knowing, right? But when you say you know something, to me that almost suggests a concretization. It almost ossifies what's happening in the mind. And so I'm, as a result, sort of reticent to retain the word science in virtue of the fact that it still seems to be pointing us in a direction where we want to subordinate what we're doing to what can be known. I think that actually can arrest our relationship with meaning. So I guess maybe I'm just being a bugbear about it and being pedantic. I don't know. So I mean, like, what is your response to that line of concern? Hello, Jean, by the way. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them there. The message thing there. Go ahead, Nadim.
Absolutely. So what happened? Why? There are two things that you said that struck me. One is what happens to the notion that I know something, and what happens to science. Number one, knowing essentially doesn't dissolve into some kind of relativization. Knowing becomes the recognition of regularity, pattern, systems of pattern. I teach mathematics, and I teach mathematics in an unusual way by applying this work to my teaching. And I've managed to teach very complex mathematics in very short spaces of time by simply saying to students, and this has been quite an experience, that what mathematics is about is pattern and structure. So the brain, the mind, the human being, we love to see patterns in nature. So that part isn't lost. So science as a systematic approach or a method to establish what are genuine patterns and what are just sheer coincidences is still a legitimate question for science. So that's one element. But why science? Why retain the notion of science? I think we really do need to challenge the natural sciences' lack of ethics. I would say that part of my work follows the kind of counter trajectory from the initial steps of the Enlightenment, then this immense disenchantment with both nature, human life. Everything is reduced, and there seems to be almost a downward trend. And lots of philosophers, thinkers have said this. The loss of religion and all this kind of stuff, broader questions. My idea is to re-enchant the whole question and claim back science to some extent, and say that we don't want a science in which the subject, who is the knowing subject, remains outside of the field of the object. Now that clearly, from my background, links very closely to quantum theory, where the subject and the object were caught in a reciprocal relationship. The very act of observation changed the conditions of what it was you were observing. Einstein hated it because he hated the idea that the subject had to be dragged in to the equation effectively. But for me, I think that spelt the end of this illusion that the natural sciences can carry on with their hegemony over all the use of the word science as an objective, truthful force in our lives. The lack of ethics.
So I guess then what you're actually advancing is that knowledge itself is grander and a richer sort of sphere than what is encountered by the discursive relay of the natural sciences. Yes, that's a kind of knowing, but we're making a mistake in reducing knowing to that kind. In fact, there are other modes of knowing. There's ethical knowing, there's aesthetic knowing, and your desire to retain the word science and to sort of which, by the way, actually put me in mind of certain Renaissance thinkers, right? Like Pico della Mirandola and some other cats like that. I think I'm saying his name correctly. And then Vico and some other people. But to enrich our sense of knowing. So then, to push it back again to the Greeks, I'm just thinking that they also had within their own discourse different senses, right? Even within, I'm not an Aristotelian, but he, is useful of this connection, right? Like he has the notion of phronesis and episteme, and there are distinctions which they have at their command, which we seem to have lost. So part of the project then, to sort of sum it up in your book here, Against Capitalist Education, is to propose the new and a deeper enrichment of our sense of knowledge, to sort of reintroduce these other ways in which we can access it.
Yep.
And so I guess now I'm in a position where I have to, there's two questions, right? I can ask here. One is that, and you say this in your book as well, that part of the problem, and it's sort of ironic because here I'm talking about distinctions, but there's a certain sort of set of distinctions that you would oppose, and I would oppose too as well. There's these strong sort of departmental specifications or specializations that occur within the academic universe, right? And this is a view that's problematic because it fractures knowledge, it atomizes it in a way which is inimical to this more integrated sensibility that I believe you're wanting to promulgate. So if you'd like, perhaps you could discuss or descant upon that. The idea that we need to repudiate specialization. The other then question is, after that, well, is the dreaded question of practicality. Like, well, this is all well and good, but now, how do you really sort of, let the rubber hit the road, as it were? How are we going to get this car going? So what are your thoughts there?
I like the use of that last metaphor of how do we get the car going, because it focuses on the idea that knowledge there is some kind of engineering concept here hidden away within that metaphor. So my issue with the specialization is that we have, and I'm all for scholarly activity and research and maintaining the tradition and turning it over and making sure we don't lose it. Absolutely, because if I didn't have that, the bookshelf I have next to me would be empty, and there would be just a handful of original works without anyone trying to draw out threads. I like that entirely. My argument is that if we have engineering, a notion of engineering on the natural sciences, we have a deformed notion of engineering on the humanities, because it's been co-opted by the social engineering, the mass social experiments, the totalitarianisms of Stalin. My argument would be that we need a type of thinker who will get a different type of car together, which will go forward. But the car we need to build, metaphorically, is one which pictures a new type of society and political system. But you can't enact that outside, in your back garden or in a laboratory. You have to enact that in some kind of context and then explore the elements of that. But I see that particular activity as something which Plato, ironically, to go back to an earlier point of yours, initiated, that he projected an idea of an imaginative society, a city-state of some kind, and then asked, well, how would it be constructed? What would happen if this happened? What would happen if that happened? But he got together in many ways, although he wasn't successful with it. You would have to do it today. You would have to have psychologists, philosophers, English departments, perhaps science departments, all working together, but actually looking at different models of how human society could be organized to one end, and that is freedom. And I think that's where we enter the difficult territory, because we have the echo of totalitarianism hanging behind this, fascism as well, that here comes someone who's going to engineer human beings to conform to a new state, and we're all going to be happy. My model is not that model of engineering. My model is to engineer a type of creative activity which explores alternatives, and the education system needs to be the place to allow that type of productivity to occur. It may be useless in the end. It may just be a bunch of effectively science fiction books that people are writing and exploring. But actually, as a research project, as a research methodology within the humanities, the possible outcome could be someone formulating, a child who's not even born today, formulating something which would just work. The whole thing could hang together. In the way that, the natural biosphere hangs together, and human society, how does it work? How does human society work? How does it actually hold itself together? What are the glue elements within it? So it seems to me that that's the kind of idea, the car I would like to see built, but not just one, but 1 trillion of them, would be, we're going to go forward, but we're going to try to imagine a society which would work, which would support human flourishing, which wouldn't demand of human beings that they have to conform. That's a massive challenge. Absolutely staggering challenge.
Right, no, and I'm not trying to be, antagonistic, because I'm very sympathetic, especially with the emphasis on the notion of freedom as being absolutely integral to the realization of the kind of society in which we can flourish, right? Freedom and equality, to to me, go hand in hand. You really actually can't have one without the other. This actually connects back to the issue of capitalism and how, resource allocation and all the rest of it. Because by subordinating one's access to certain basic material conditions to an economic calculus, you're really depriving people of entering into right space subjectively. And I'm not just talking in terms of like having enough. It's not just a question of having a roof over your head and food in your belly. You have to be in like the right space. I don't want to use the word psychologically because I don't want to import the whole discourse of psychology, right? That's why I said subjectively. In order to relate with human beings in that way, which conduces to genuine flourishing. But to me, this actually confronts the issue of institutionality, right? Even abstracting from capitalism itself, right? Institutionality is a real issue here. And how can you connect the issue of education and what is an ideal education with constructing an institution that doesn't undermine it? Because it seems like institutions are strongly drawn to organization along lines of hierarchy and authority that will generally often dampen the encounter of a genuine education. And how do you respond to that concern? You talk about building an alternative educational framework in the book within an alternative institution. How does that institution avoid the pitfalls of structuration and institutionality and authority and hierarchy and so forth?
I think you put your finger on one of the fundamental issues of trying to make this project work imaginatively for it. I mean, when you say institution, I also see that our current behavior of our institutions, although they might see themselves as entity with their internal dynamics, their interface to the wider systems and social fabric and political and economic worlds turn their behavior into a symptom of the flaws of the wider system. So, I often find myself thinking that when we look at our current versions of education, our universities, and we ask ourselves, are those universal models that somehow are archetypes and it's inevitable that they're going to follow in that structure? Or is there some set of conditions, economic largely, that have somehow made them neurotic? So they don't function properly. So they do, as you say, become hierarchical, they're autocratic. They do become subservient to an economic system that they have no power to resist. They do somehow become qualification machines to churn out people and output. They do sit into a system where they feel they're measured on league tables. I don't know if in the US you have league tables to the same extent as we have. I'm sure they're everywhere. But this whole thing is a symptom of the current system, the whole current way of thinking. And if you trace it back, you will find again and again value is constantly attached to number. And so institutions who are caught in this symptomatic trap of trying to raise their own value do it in a system that can't help but just lead us to this ridiculous situation. So when I look at an institution and I think, how could you develop an alternative institution and how could you do it? It's more about, for me, what are the conditions that would allow an individual, if you think about Plato's strategy and Aristotle, we can combine the two and see if we can come up with something that makes sense. Plato used the microcosm of an individual psychology versus a social structure. So if you ask the question about what is it that makes an individual flourish, which is more Aristotle's idea, what are the legal and the systems of justice around to allow freedom to operate within that? And then ask yourself, clearly you can't simply translate it up into institutional level because we're not ants in a colony. And our parts of our body don't, as Plato incorrectly saw, we're like arms of a bigger organic system. So then you have to turn to a much more richer analysis of political and social regimes. And you find that going on in Plato. And I'm sort of at the beginning of really trying to tease out this element in Aristotle's thought, that ethical considerations of the individual couple with political, social, but they don't collapse into each other. So I might flourish under condition A, but condition A is part of a wider set of conditions which would allow a social collective to malfunction, not to flourish. So we have to be very careful how I manipulate these two things. And I honestly think that actually Aristotle, of all the thinkers I can picture, provides some step into this in looking at his examination of regimes, political regimes.
Sorry, I got slightly distracted toward the end because I was looking here at Madhouse Polls. He's asked about ethical considerations. Could you clarify your question there, Madhouse Polls? Because, well, I mean, and yeah, could you recap your point about Aristotle? I'm sorry, I got slightly distracted.
Yeah, no, I'll do it very, very quickly. So, if we're to take this issue very seriously, we have to avoid Plato's trap of the microcosm mapping, scaling up.
I don't think so. No, in fact, don't let me put words in your mouth, Nadim. I don't think that you're assuming a kind of Kantian deontological framework, right? The moral view does not reduce, but the ethical view does not reduce to just objective suppositions or imperatives, right? It's actually a far more open and fluid thing. I mean, maybe I could ask you, what would you say characterizes specifically the ground of the ethical or the moral?
I would say, and this is going to sound like the most paradoxical thing, an ontology, the notion of ontology, which was the classical image was ontology was essentially the ground upon which ethics would be built. So interestingly enough, when you get the imperative and the notion in Kantian thought, and you see it later on, that you sever that connection, for me, it misses the sense that there is something in the human structure, the human nature itself, which has an ontological basis of its ethics. I'm not saying that there is an ethic that we have and we're missing the point, because disagreement is built into what we do. What I'm saying is that ethics as a dimension of being human is an ontological feature of a human being. It can't be subtracted out of this equation. So you and I may disagree on the notion of what justice means, but we both seem to have an idea of justice. Now, someone might come along and say, oh, hang on a second. There are people who have no sense of justice, and they go around psychopaths and various different things. My argument is this, and this is not a cop-out. I think we are in an age obsessed with those instances demonstrate a kind of circularity and kind of an endless obsession with cases. If how can I put it? I'm not saying it well.
Well, can I make a suggestion? Ontological, you're just saying it's grounded in our encounter with being. And I think that what's useful about that phrase is it sort of advises us that we can sometimes become mesmerized by the label moral or the label ethical as describing something which can be simply explicated. But in fact, it cannot be simply explicated. It's something which one encounters. If you like, it's something which one encounters within oneself. But this, and I think this is earlier, but you talked about it right at the outset. But it might be useful to note that a presupposition of your work here against capital education is that reality or being cannot be reduced to atomic terms. That the basic unit, if you like, of reality is actually trifold in nature, by which I remind me, I'm so sorry, is that there's the individual and there's the context. Could you just describe that? Because I think that will help sort of clarify where the ethical enters into the issue, how it emerges.
So we tend to think that there is an entity. If you place an image of an entity, an image of someone or something in the middle of the picture, to one side you place a situation, something which signifies a room, a place, a situation therein. It doesn't have to be physical, it could be an emotional context, a mood, etc. And on the other side, if you place the idea of an action or a response, but the response is to the context and situation, that entity or being in the middle is relating to. And here's the trick. The very entity in the center is itself constituted by this reciprocal relationship between context and response. The moment you strip out context, you strip out responses, because there's nothing to respond to, you lose the entity in the center.
Or perhaps another way of putting it, which is a little gross and a bit hazardous because I'm using the word subject, object, and it is this, that we tend to think that the subject and the object can be disentangled, but in fact they can't. Or another way of putting it is that, you can't actually separate your being from that of the world. There's a tension between those poles, but the poles themselves cannot actually be extricated from each other. And so the ethical or the moral describes a kind of point or where you are engaging with that tension in a particular way. Camus talked about it in terms of responding to the experience of the absurd. Now, you got another question here. Would you agree with the proposition that categorization is a heuristic measure? Well, I would. That's almost the definitional, right? I mean, a heuristic, depending on what you mean by heuristic measure, right? But when you say heuristic measure to me, it's like a way of thinking about something or a rule of thumb, which is almost sort of like presupposing that you've already categorized things to make them amenable to working within your heuristic frame. But I don't know, would you agree with that, Nadim?
I would say that the issue of category is really, really a bit of a problem. There are two elements. One is that Kant largely inherited Aristotle's categories, but I don't think the categories in Kant or in Aristotle really work. And I can say that, although I think other elements of the thinking does, because I think the notion of a category and rests on the notion of a distinction, and the notion of a distinction seems to suggest another set of relationships which haven't quite been captured by the category. So I think the notion of a category is a secondary or a derivatory idea, and there is something more fundamental, like a field or a structure of relations, out of which these various categories appear. So heuristic measure is a good way of putting it, because in a sense, categories emerge in different situations, and we respond to things through various categories, but there is nothing absolute or given about any particular set of categories in this sense. So yes, as a rule of thumb for a situation, it can be very, very.
So, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I actually have to go. It's about an hour. We've been talking for just about an hour.
Okay.
And I'm afraid that I have to shut it off. So let me ask you, well, if you want to keep on, certainly you're welcome to do so. But do you want to make any concluding sort of thought about your book Against Capitalist Education before at least formally end the recorded portion of the blab?
Absolutely. If I can just thank you very much for talking to me about it. Can I say that one characteristic of my own thinking is this reluctance to adopt and accept things that are given to me. So all of my work is, in a sense, an attempt to digest and assimilate and understand stuff. And my failure to understand isn't seen as a fundamental failure, but actually as an opportunity to learn something more. And if you can permit me to say one last thing about the subject and the object, one of the traditional flaws in this way of thinking is that you have the object. If you were to use a really crude image, the object confronts the subject. So I hold a pen in front of me, and there's a pen, I see it. And all the models of the 18th century were built around that simplification. But what that misses are two relationships which are built into a subject and an object. Number one, in order for me to encounter it as a pen, I have to encounter it through some situation which makes sense of it to appear as a pen. And that context itself is not given by the pen. And it isn't actually just given by me as a subject in my internal constitution. It is built out of these social relations. I would say that sadly, Wittgenstein is only seen as a deflationary philosopher, but a lot of my philosophical work is in direct response. The challenge that Wittgenstein set was, how could you construct a metaphysics or an ontology after the later Wittgenstein, after all of his critique of the way language works, thought functions, meaning works? Could you build something in a constructive direction? And my argument is, yes, you can. And that inspires the idea that what we are at the moment, we're in the cusp of formulating new positions and new philosophical approaches and methods, which themselves may, do some magic when it comes to reviving our sense of humanity.
Well, again, thank you, Nadim. I'm going to pop out, pause the recording. So